They brought black women in to be humiliated. What they didn't know was they'd just handed the stage to the very woman whose stolen genius powered the broken engine behind her. In 30 minutes, a black woman with no badge and no title would dismantle not just a machine, but the entire culture that thought she should stay silent. And if stories like this shake something loose in you, if they make you want to stand up for brilliance in disguise, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe now. Because what unfolds next is something no one in that room saw coming. It began with a smirk. Richard Morrison, CEO of Aeroch Industries, circled Kesha Williams in front of 200 engineers, executives, and media professionals like a wolf performing for its pack. She had no lab coat, no credentials, no invitation, just calm hands and an unapologetic voice. "You really think you can fix what my Harvard and MIT teams couldn't solve in 3 weeks?" he said, dragging the word "you" like it was a joke only he understood. She didn't flinch. In that silence, that unnerving poise, it wasn't defiance, it was calculation. Because while the world laughed, Kesha wasn't figuring out the problem. She already knew the answer. She was deciding whether now was the time to show it. Morrison had staged the entire event like a public execution. Smartphones were already up, ready to capture the moment the outsider failed. 30 minutes, he declared. If you fail, and we know you will. This will serve as an example to every dreamer who thinks we owe them time. The room chuckled. His voice oozed with the certainty of a man who believed access was the same thing as ability. But 2 rows back, Dr. Stephen Walsh, the company's head of engineering, narrowed his eyes when Kesha mentioned the modified injection system within seconds. That detail had taken his elite team weeks to uncover. How did she see it so fast? And more importantly, how did she know it wasn't part of the original specs? Kesha stood still, her expression unreadable. Inside her chest, a storm raged. This wasn't a challenge. It was a setup. She recognized the T8000 turbobin engine the moment she walked in, not because it was famous, but because it was familiar. She'd designed part of the original combustion model during her years at NASA, before the betrayal. Before Project Meridian was shut down for national security, she knew who'd taken it, how it had been buried, and who had profited from it. And now, the man who thought he was humiliating her, he was unknowingly handing her the mic to expose it all? Kesha reached for her phone, typed 3 words. "It's time, Marcus." 500 miles away, Marcus Chun, her old colleague, sat in a secure room at the Pentagon. When he saw the message, he didn't hesitate. He opened the classified file marked Project Phoenix, a 3-year federal investigation into aerospace tech theft tied to private contractors. Aeroch Industries was at the top of the list, and now the trap they'd walked into was about to close. But back in the auditorium, Morrison was still smiling. "Hope you brought a backup plan," he chuckled. "Because fixing that engine won't help when your credibility burns out in front of this audience." Kesha didn't answer. She moved with quiet confidence, inspecting the engine like it was a childhood memory. Her hands, steady and precise, glided over components the way a conductor reads music. She wasn't searching, she was confirming. And then she turned toward Morrison, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Before I begin, may I ask how you obtained the original schematics for this engine?" The question landed like a brick through glass. Morrison's smugness faltered. How did she know about the classified schematics? "That's not relevant," he snapped, but it was too late. The room shifted. The narrative cracked. This wasn't just a technical exercise anymore. This was something else. Bigger, smarter. Dangerous to the wrong people, and the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the engine. It was the woman they had tried to erase, who had returned with a plan. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to reveal them. If you're already gripped by this story, if you've ever felt underestimated or watched someone powerful mock someone brave, now is the time to act. Tap like. Share this story with anyone who's ever dared to show up in a room that didn't want them. And subscribe right now. Because what happens next doesn't just change Kesha's life. It changes an entire industry built on stolen brilliance. The moment she asked about the original schematics, a crack appeared, not in the engine, but in Morrison's mask. He stumbled over his response like a man caught speeding in front of a sheriff. "That's not relevant," he said too quickly, but relevance wasn't the problem, exposure was. Kesha had delivered the first blow with a question, not a tool, and suddenly the tone in the room shifted. The audience, once hungry for a spectacle, grew quiet, not out of respect but confusion. Something was off. This wasn't the performance they were promised. The woman who'd walked in alone was no longer standing alone. She was circling something much bigger than the engine, and Morrison could feel it. Kesha turned her attention back to the T-8000 like she was flipping a page in a book she'd read 1,000 times. Her hands moved with methodical precision, disassembling a complex section of the combustion system without consulting any diagrams. She murmured under her breath, "Modified phase injectors, intentionally destabilized." Dr. Walsh blinked. That exact phrasing had been buried in his team's internal diagnostics, and it wasn't public knowledge. His assistant leaned over, whispering, "Did she just quote our report?" Walsh didn't respond, because he recognized that tone. He had heard it once before, in a locked NASA lab 3 years ago, coming from a voice they were told had been removed for good. And if what he was realizing was true, then Irach wasn't just at risk of a technical embarrassment. It was about to be buried in a scandal. At the Pentagon, Marcus opened the encrypted portal and uploaded the final Project Phoenix batch. Kesha had given the green light. He clicked authorize on a federal warrant for digital surveillance of Aerochi's research systems. The evidence they'd spent 3 years collecting, emails, financial transfers, internal modifications, was already streaming into secure government servers. But even Marcus, who had helped write the algorithm, wasn't prepared for what the system flagged next. A direct payment from Northrop Dynamic to a shell account belonging to Dr. Walsh's cousin. An account tied to an off-site server housing proprietary Meridian files. It wasn't just theft. It was military-grade espionage dressed as innovation. And now they had the chain of custody. But it had to be Kesha who pulled the trigger. Back in the auditorium, Morrison kept pushing, louder now, trying to drown out the undercurrent of control slipping away from him. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is why protocol exists. When you hand complex machinery to amateurs, you get confusion, chaos, false confidence." He gestured toward Kesha, who was now detaching the fourth component in a sequence that matched the original NASA design. What Morrison couldn't see was that the real chaos wasn't on the engine. It was behind his back, on the faces of the engineers who had started whispering among themselves, "Why is she removing the fuel stabilizer?" "That's buried 3 layers deep," someone said. Another answered, "She's not guessing. She knows what's under the casing before she touches it." Walsh took a breath that tasted like fear. He leaned forward and whispered one name, Kesha Williams. At that moment, a low chime rang from Morrison's phone. He glanced down, annoyed, then froze. The notification was from the Department of Defense. It wasn't a news alert. It was a legal directive. Irach Industries was now officially under investigation for possible violations of federal research integrity protocols. In 30 minutes, a federal team would be entering the facility. Morrison's eyes darted to the audience, to the cameras. To Kesha, who hadn't stopped moving, he walked briskly toward her, dropping his performative grin. "What is this? You set us up?" She didn't look up. "I told you I could identify the problem," she said calmly. "What I didn't tell you was how I knew it." That was the pivot, the point where Morrison realized he hadn't been orchestrating a downfall. He had walked into a trial, and he was the exhibit. Walsh backed away slowly, scanning for a way out, but his body felt like concrete. He remembered every meeting, every approval stamp, every contract he hadn't read closely because it came from someone he trusted, and now that trust was being reversed like a mirror flipped in daylight. Kesha didn't just fix machines, she engineered truth. Quietly, completely, deliberately. And every bolt she turned was a statement. You can't erase brilliance just because you're afraid of it. So here's your takeaway. It's not about proving yourself to people who were never listening. It's about building your case in silence, so when the noise finally erupts, you're already holding the receipts. And if you're still here, still with me, then don't let Kesha's work go unseen. Tap like if you've ever been underestimated. Share this with someone who needs to remember that calm doesn't mean powerless. And subscribe now, because in the next part, you'll find out exactly what happened to the NASA research they said never existed and who paid to keep it buried. It wasn't beginner's luck, it wasn't some wild guess. Kesha's hands didn't hesitate because they weren't hunting, they were confirming. Her fingertips moved like memory, not trial and error. The engine she was dissecting wasn't a puzzle. It was a crime scene, and she had written half the blueprint. Every part she pulled exposed more than a technical flaw. It was revealing a cover-up that spanned labs, contracts, and bank accounts. And now, with the Pentagon locked in and Morrison sweating bullets under the halogen lights, the entire auditorium was about to find out that the woman they tried to mock into silence had been quietly recording everything for 3 years. The first whisper of truth came from Dr. Walsh, or rather, from his face. As Kesha removed the 7th component, an injector with micro-etchings only visible under infrared, his entire posture collapsed. That component wasn't part of any public spec. It was military-grade tech, designed by Project Meridian, a NASA program buried under federal silence after a supposed data breach. But Walsh had seen it once, 3 years ago, when it passed through a lab tagged with a name that had since disappeared from government rolls. Dr. Kesha Williams. He hadn't seen her since. He thought she'd moved on, or been pushed out quietly. What he never expected was that she'd turn their own creation into a surveillance system they couldn't see. And now, she wasn't just exposing an engine. She was about to blow the hinges off the door they'd tried to lock behind her. At that exact moment, Marcus Chun accessed the dormant Meridian servers, using a one-time clearance code that had been waiting, untouched, for 36 months. He decrypted a series of embedded files, each one paired to a specific component Kesha was now uncovering in real time. The files weren't just blueprints. They were voice logs, metadata tags, meeting transcripts, and biometric IDs. And every single one tied AirWatch to a long chain of tech laundering operations across 3 defense contractors. Worse, they traced signatures back to someone inside the Department of Energy. This wasn't just corporate theft, it was federal betrayal. And all of it was time-stamped to the weeks following Kesha's forced departure. Marcus initiated Protocol Echo, which would feed the data directly to FBI cybercrime units and the Senate Oversight Committee without needing press approval or internal leaks. Back in the auditorium, Morrison was losing oxygen in his own lie. He paced, wiped his forehead, and tried to refocus the attention. "Let's not get distracted here," he said, straining to sound authoritative. The point of this demonstration was to fix the engine, not chase conspiracies. But nobody was listening to him anymore. Engineers leaned in, assistants exchanged silent glances. And the press? They had stopped filming Morrison entirely. Every lens was on Kesha. Because she wasn't improvising, she was testifying. Each movement, each part she revealed, was supported by undeniable digital proof. When she opened her phone again, she didn't call anyone. She simply tapped a button. The auditorium screens behind her flickered, then lit up with timestamps, classified memos, encrypted chats, all matching the parts she'd already removed. The twist wasn't that the tech was stolen. The twist was that she had booby-trapped the very designs they took. Kesha had coded an invisible watchdog system into the original schematics, one that quietly recorded every change, every adaptation, every conversation within 20 feet of the engine core. and for 3 years it had been transmitting encrypted packets to a dormant cloud. As soon as the T-8000 was activated at Erach, the system awoke. The engine hadn't just failed. It had started talking, and everything it said pointed to Morrison, Walsh, and a half-dozen high-level collaborators who thought they'd scrubbed their fingerprints. But fingerprints don't fade from data. And Keisha had built the ultimate forensic engine, not to win praise, but to prove that no matter how far they pushed her, the truth would one day pull them back in. Let's stop here and ask something simple. What kind of person builds a trap, then walks into it just to show you how it works? Someone who's been underestimated long enough to turn humiliation into architecture. Someone who doesn't raise her voice, but raises the floor under your feet until your throne becomes your prison. Keisha didn't just survive her erasure, she planned her resurrection. And when you're that prepared, you don't show up with proof. You are the proof. If this part made your jaw drop, good, because it's not just about her. It's about everyone who's been told to stay in their lane. Everyone whose ideas were stolen, whose names were erased from the patent, whose work was passed off as someone else's shortcut to power. Hit like if you've ever built something in the dark. Drop a comment if you've been there. Watching your own brilliance be credited to the person who blocked your raise. And subscribe now, because in the next part, the arrest warrants drop and the auditorium turns into the courtroom no one saw coming. By the time the auditorium screens lit up with classified documents, Morrison's smirk had become a twitch. The audience, once entertained by the spectacle, now sat paralyzed, watching their reality unravel in real time. Each file was time-stamped, location tagged, and paired with digital voice recordings. Not just memos, not just emails, but full-blown conversations behind closed doors. One clip played aloud through the auditorium speakers. Morrison mocking diversity hires while signing off on a project built from stolen NASA research. Another showed Dr. Walsh dismissing whistleblower concerns and approving payments funneled through shell companies linked to his cousin. The room wasn't just watching a scandal, it was witnessing a fall from power, frame by frame. Morrison lunged toward the control panel, slamming his hand against the touchscreen. Nothing responded. The system was locked. Keisha hadn't just prepared the data, she had built a delivery system immune to sabotage. Marcus's voice echoed through the speakers. Calm, clipped, undeniable. Broadcast authorization confirmed. DOJ case file 2998D Meridian leak now public. Morrison turned to Keisha, voice shaking. This is illegal! You don't have permission to air this! She didn't flinch. Federal warrant, she said plainly, lifting her phone without even turning toward him. Issued 2 hours ago. The FBI is already downloading every server connected to Erach. Right on cue, 2 agents appeared at the rear entrance of the auditorium, their badges catching the stage lights like judgment incarnate. As the agents made their way forward, the crowd instinctively split. Journalists raised their phones higher, engineers stepped back. Morrison tried to slip off the stage, but Keisha turned slightly and spoke, not loudly, but with enough gravity to freeze him mid-step. Richard, she said, you should stay. After all, you invited everyone. One agent addressed the room directly. Richard Morrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit industrial espionage, unlawful possession of classified materials, and obstruction of federal investigation. The handcuffs weren't dramatic, they were quiet, procedural, inevitable. Morrison didn't resist. Not because he agreed, but because he had finally realized resistance would only delay the inevitable. Dr. Walsh took one step toward the exit but was intercepted by another agent. Dr. Stephen Walsh, we have several questions about your role in technology adaptation and your participation in suppressed whistleblower reports. His face collapsed into disbelief. I didn't know! My cousin handled the contracts. I was never told. Keisha cut in with surgical calm. Stephen, you signed off on 14 reports that referenced Meridian technology. You knew. You didn't care. The silence was louder than any accusation. For the first time, he looked at her not with superiority, but with the full weight of what he had ignored. His denial wasn't strategic, it was habit, and that habit had just cost him everything. Then the real twist hit. As the agents removed both men from the auditorium, the broadcast screens shifted again. Marcus had uploaded the internal footage from Eroch's board meetings, footage Kesha had obtained through a back door she built into the firmware of the stolen tech. Videos played of Morrison laughing off safety risks, mocking female engineers, and dismissing data that predicted catastrophic engine failures. One clip caught him saying, "If the cost of innovation is burning through a few nobodies, so be it." The room didn't gasp. It groaned, because that wasn't just arrogance, it was institutional rot. And no one, not even his loyal lieutenants, could defend it now. Here's the hard truth. When people talk about change, they rarely talk about consequence. They want reform without reckoning, apologies without audit, but change that matters requires rupture. And that rupture? It only happens when someone like Kesha refuses to play along, refuses to stay small, refuses to let her silence be sold as complicity. She didn't just turn the cameras on them, she turned the lights on the whole system. So if this moment hit you, if watching power finally answer to the truth sent a chill down your spine, hit like if you've ever watched someone dodge accountability while stepping on the people doing the real work, share this story and subscribe now, because in Part 5, we see what happens when the empire of arrogance collapses and a new order rises from its ashes. The engine roared back to life with a sound that silenced the entire auditorium. It wasn't just a mechanical hum, it was resurrection. For the first time in 3 years, the T-8000 breathed with the rhythm it was meant to have. That sound wasn't coming from a miracle. It was coming from restoration. Kesha had done it, not with bravado, not with guesses, but with knowledge they'd tried to erase. The same woman they'd mocked was now the only person in the building who could make that machine move. And the machine's rebirth was more than symbolism. It was testimony. She didn't just know the engine, she was its origin. The very thing they tried to break had become the force that broke them. As Morrison and Walsh were escorted out, the journalists swarmed forward, but Kesha didn't answer a single question. Her work wasn't about sound bites. It was about correction. Elena Rodriguez, the only Hispanic executive left standing at Eroch, approached her slowly. "Dr. Williams," she said, tears rising, "thank you for proving we weren't paranoid. We weren't imagining the barriers. You showed them to the world." Kesha nodded without ego. "You were never alone, Elena. You were just never heard. And that's the difference. It's not about having something to say. It's about finally being listened to. That's the moment that breaks silence open like thunder." But the fall wasn't finished yet. Inside the executive boardroom, agents uncovered dozens of files. Offshore transfers, signed NDAs, audio clips of internal conversations where senior staff laughed about quieting the problem before it becomes a lawsuit. The problem was Kesha. And the lawsuit, it had just become a federal case. One file revealed a $50 million payout labeled contingency assurance, made to Daniel Walsh, the very man who once shared Kesha's life and ultimately stole her research to sell upward. It wasn't just betrayal, it was an orchestrated exile. And now, every piece of that orchestration was being displayed on the public record. Walsh's academic license was revoked within 48 hours. Morrison's assets were frozen. The empire they'd built from stolen fire had turned to ash in their hands. Meanwhile, Elena received a call from the board of directors. With Morrison removed and Walsh disqualified, they offered her the interim CEO position. She declined. "There's only one person who should lead this company forward," she said. "The woman who rebuilt it from its ruins." The next morning, Dr. Kesha Williams was named Chief Scientific Officer of Eroch, with a mandate to restructure the entire research division. She didn't take a victory lap. She took a screwdriver, walked back into the lab, and started mentoring 3 interns from public universities. One of them had never been in a research facility before. "You don't need a fancy degree to be extraordinary," she told him. "You just need someone to stop moving the finish line every time you get close." And that's the shift we forget to talk about. Not just punishment, but repair, not just pulling weeds, but planting something better in their place. Kesha didn't just expose the rot, she redefined what it meant to lead. She didn't take power to hoard it. She took power to make space for people who'd never been allowed to walk in the room, let alone sit at the table. She understood something Morrison never could. True leadership doesn't scream. It listens. It amplifies. It remembers what it's like to be underestimated, and then turns that memory into fuel. If this section gave you goosebumps, if it reminded you that justice isn't just about takedowns, it's about transformation, then let it sit with you, like this story. Don't let it scroll past you. Hit like if you believe the future belongs to those who rebuild, not just those who expose. Share this with someone who's still waiting for their voice to be heard. And subscribe right now, because in the final part, the conclusion, we'll see how Kesha's quiet revolution doesn't just change one company, it changes everything. 6 months later, the Wall Street Journal didn't whisper. It roared. Eroch, under new leadership, breaks records in innovation and ethics. Beneath the headline, a photograph spoke louder than any press release. Dr. Kesha Williams and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, side by side, standing in front of the most advanced aerospace research facility in the country. A lab once ruled by exclusion was now a birthplace for progress. And for anyone still clinging to the myth that humiliation wins, the picture was proof that dignity, preparation, and time could flip a rigged system on its head. Kesha didn't celebrate the way Morrison once did, with champagne and ego. She celebrated by showing up at 6 a.m., tying her hair back, and training 3 interns, none of whom had Ivy League degrees and all of whom had once been told they weren't quite qualified. The new Eroch didn't look like the old Eroch. This wasn't accidental. The scholarship program Kesha and Elena created targeted underfunded schools, overlooked communities, and aspiring engineers who had brilliance but lacked access. Within months, over 200 students had received offers to train under the same roof that once wouldn't let them through the front door. The message was clear. The future of aerospace was going to look a lot more like the people who actually built it. Meanwhile, Morrison sat behind bars in a federal facility, his empire reduced to footnotes and his assets liquidated to pay restitution. Every few weeks he heard echoes of Eroch's new successes, the Phoenix engine gaining market dominance, government contracts awarded with zero ethical objections, and global praise for inclusive hiring. He had tried to bury a woman and ended up fertilizing a movement. Dr. Stephen Walsh didn't fare much better. His professional licenses were revoked, and his name was pulled from dozens of journal articles. He now sold insurance in a small town, forced to explain his fall from grace to every stranger who Googled his name. But the real dagger came quietly. Daniel Walsh, the man who once shared Kesha's future before selling off her past, reached out through legal channels. He asked for a meeting, a conversation, closure. Kesha replied through her attorneys with a single final sentence: "The past is over. Focus on the future." Because forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, it's elevation. Letting someone watch from the ground while you build everything they said you couldn't, brick by brilliant brick. At Eroch, Elena was officially named CEO. Her first act? Signing a policy that permanently banned the use of non-disclosure agreements in discrimination settlements. "If we have to hide it," she said at the press conference, "we shouldn't be doing it." Kesha stood beside her, offering no applause, just a nod. Their leadership wasn't about optics. It was about oxygen, giving space to ideas that used to suffocate in silence. They reopened investigations into prior contract denials, rehired engineers who'd been pushed out, and established the Meridian Fellowship, a full-ride grant named after the program that had nearly destroyed Kesha's career. Now that name was synonymous with restoration. The Phoenix series, Eroch's renamed flagship engine, broke industry records within the year. Its efficiency was unmatched. Its cost savings stunned even the most skeptical analysts. Orders poured in from defense agencies, commercial airlines, and international buyers. But for Kesha, the real reward wasn't profit. It was watching a young black girl on a school tour walk up to the display engine, place her hand on the metal, and whisper, "She built this." That moment, quiet, honest, full of wonder, was worth more than any award on her desk. And in fact, her desk had no awards, no framed diplomas, no headlines, just prototypes, scribbles, and mentoring schedules. Because greatness doesn't have to shout when it knows exactly where it's going. Kesha was later invited to speak at MIT, her alma mater, but this time she didn't bring slides or scripts. She looked out at the sea of faces, many of them women, many of them black or brown or first gen, and she said this: "They told me I was too ambitious, too direct, too confident for someone who hadn't earned her seat. But the truth is, some of us aren't meant to take seats. We're meant to build the table." The auditorium erupted, not because it was flashy, but because it was true. Every woman in that room had felt it. The slow erosion of belief, the constant recalibration of tone, the need to prove their presence had merit. Kesha had felt it too, and now she stood as proof that you can reclaim what they stole, even if they called it theirs while doing it. But her final victory wasn't a quote or a camera flash. It was the silence, the peace, the fact that for the first time in years she could do her work without looking over her shoulder. She had survived erasure, betrayal, theft, and public humiliation, and turned it all into momentum. She wasn't a symbol. She was a system reprogrammed, a new blueprint written in her own voice. So if her journey stirred something in you, if it lit up that place inside you that's tired of shrinking, tired of waiting for permission, tired of apologizing for brilliance, then take this story as your cue. Hit like if you've ever been dismissed and kept receipts. Share this if you believe justice is something we build, not something we beg for. And subscribe right now, because this story may be ending, but your story might be next. And just like Kesha, you don't have to prove them wrong, you just have to outlast the lie.